Welcome back. In this lesson, we're exploring the topic of environmental laws and public policy. This topic touches on government decisions, public opinion, economic considerations, and the practical challenges of protecting the environment. Let's hear how Finn responds to a series of questions on this topic.
What difficulties might governments face when introducing new environmental laws?
One major challenge is public resistance, especially if the law affects people's daily routines or increases costs. For example, a ban on certain plastic products might be good for the environment, but some consumers and businesses could see it as inconvenient. Governments also have to consider the economic impact of new regulations. If environmental rules are introduced too quickly, some industries may struggle to adapt. Another issue is enforcement, because a law is only effective if authorities have the resources to monitor compliance. As a result, governments often have to balance environmental goals with economic and political realities.
Do you think environmental laws should be the same across all regions of a country? Why or why not?
Not necessarily. Different regions often face different environmental challenges, so a one-size-fits-all approach may not be effective. For instance, coastal areas might need stricter regulations on marine pollution, whereas inland regions could be more concerned about air quality or water shortages. That being said, I think there should still be a set of national standards that apply everywhere. Otherwise, some regions might adopt very weak policies and undermine the country's overall environmental efforts. In my view, the best approach is a combination of nationwide rules and local flexibility.
How can authorities ensure that environmental regulations are enforced effectively?
First of all, there should be regular inspections and clear monitoring systems. If companies know there is little chance of being checked, they may be tempted to ignore the rules. Financial penalties can also be effective, especially when they are substantial enough to discourage violations. At the same time, transparency is important. When environmental data is publicly available, businesses tend to be more accountable because their reputation is at stake. Ultimately, enforcement works best when there is both strong oversight and genuine public awareness.
Should companies receive rewards for meeting environmental standards, or should penalties be the main approach?
I think both approaches have their place. Penalties are necessary because some companies will only change their behavior if there are consequences for breaking the rules. However, incentives can encourage businesses to go beyond the minimum requirements. For example, tax breaks or public recognition programs might motivate companies to invest in cleaner technologies. A system based solely on punishment could create resentment, while one based only on rewards might not be taken seriously. That's why I believe a balanced combination of incentives and penalties is the most effective solution.
Can strict environmental laws have a negative impact on employment or economic growth?
In the short term, they certainly can. Some industries may face higher operating costs, and a few businesses could even lay off workers if they struggle to comply with new regulations. However, I don't think that's the whole picture. Environmental laws often create demand for new technologies and sustainable industries, which can generate jobs of their own. We can already see this happening in sectors such as renewable energy and electric vehicles. So, while there may be temporary economic challenges, the long-term benefits often outweigh the initial costs.
Why do some environmental policies receive public support while others face opposition?
I think it largely depends on how the policy affects people's lives. If the benefits are obvious and the inconvenience is minimal, people are generally willing to support it. On the other hand, policies that increase living expenses or restrict personal choices often face resistance. Another factor is trust. People are more likely to back environmental measures if they believe the government is acting transparently and fairly. Public opinion can also be influenced by how well the policy is explained. When people understand the reasoning behind a decision, they tend to be more accepting of it.
Do you think international cooperation is necessary to address environmental issues effectively?
Absolutely. Many environmental problems don't stop at national borders, so it would be difficult for any single country to solve them alone. Climate change is probably the best example because emissions produced in one country can affect the entire planet. International cooperation also allows countries to share technology, expertise, and financial resources. Of course, reaching agreements can be challenging because different nations have different priorities. Even so, I believe cooperation is essential if we want meaningful and lasting progress. Without it, environmental efforts are likely to be much less effective.
How might environmental laws change in the future as technology continues to develop?
I expect environmental laws to become more sophisticated and data driven. Advances in technology are making it easier to track pollution levels and monitor compliance in real time. As a result, governments may rely less on manual inspections and more on automated systems. I also think new regulations will be introduced to address emerging technologies that we can't fully anticipate today. For example, lawmakers may need to create rules for industries that currently don't exist or are still in their early stages. Overall, technology will probably make environmental regulation both more precise and more effective.
That brings us to the end of Finn's interview. Now let's break down each response and look at the key ideas discussed in the answers. Let's begin with the first question. What difficulties might governments face when introducing new environmental laws? In his response, Finn identifies several challenges that governments need to consider. He begins with public resistance, explaining that people may oppose environmental measures if they increase costs or make everyday activities less convenient. He then broadens the discussion to include businesses and industries, pointing out that some sectors may struggle to adapt if new regulations are introduced too quickly. Another issue he mentions is enforcement, since environmental laws are only effective when authorities have the resources to monitor compliance. Overall, his answer highlights the difficulty of balancing environmental objectives with economic and political concerns. Question 2. Do you think environmental laws should be the same across all regions of a country? Finn argues that environmental laws do not necessarily need to be identical across all regions. He explains that different regions face different environmental challenges, using coastal and inland areas as examples. However, he doesn't argue for completely separate systems. Instead, he suggests that national standards should still exist to ensure a consistent level of environmental protection across the country. His conclusion is that the most effective approach combines nationwide regulations with enough flexibility to address local conditions. Question 3. How can authorities ensure that environmental regulations are enforced effectively? Finn focuses on several practical ways to make sure environmental laws are actually followed. He begins by mentioning regular inspections and monitoring systems, which help authorities identify violations. He also discusses financial penalties, arguing that they can discourage companies from breaking the rules. Another key point is transparency. By making environmental information publicly available, governments can increase accountability and encourage businesses to protect their reputation. Overall, Finn suggests that effective enforcement depends on a combination of oversight, accountability, and public awareness. Question 4. Should companies receive rewards for meeting environmental standards, or should penalties be the main approach? Rather than choosing one option over the other, Finn argues that both approaches are necessary. He explains that penalties are important because they create consequences for companies that fail to comply with environmental regulations. At the same time, rewards can encourage businesses to do more than the minimum required. To support this idea, he gives examples such as tax incentives and public recognition programs. His overall view is that environmental policy works best when it combines encouragement with accountability. Question 5. Can strict environmental laws have a negative impact on employment or economic growth? Finn begins by acknowledging that strict regulations can create short-term economic difficulties. He points out that businesses may face higher cost and that some industries could experience job losses while adjusting to new requirements. However, he doesn't stop there. He goes on to discuss the opportunities created by environmental regulation, particularly in areas such as renewable energy and electric vehicles. By considering both the short-term costs and the long-term benefits, he presents a balanced view of the issue. Question 6. Why do some environmental policies receive public support while others face opposition? According to Finn, public reactions often depend on how a policy affects people's daily lives. If the benefits are clear and the inconvenience is relatively small, people are generally more willing to support environmental measures. On the other hand, policies that increase living costs or limit personal freedom can face greater resistance. He also emphasizes the importance of trust, arguing that people are more supportive when they believe governments are acting fairly and transparently. Finally, he points out that clear communication can influence public opinion by helping people understand the reasons behind a policy. Question 7. Do you think international cooperation is necessary to address environmental issues effectively? Finn's answer is a clear yes. He explains that many environmental problems cross national borders, which means no single country can solve them entirely on its own. He uses climate change as an example, explaining that emissions produced in one country can affect people around the world. He also notes that cooperation allows countries to share technology, expertise, and financial resources. Although he acknowledges that international agreements can be difficult to achieve, he ultimately argues that meaningful progress depends on countries working together. Finally, question 8. How might environmental laws change in the future as technology continues to develop? Finn discusses several ways technological developments could influence environmental laws in the future. He suggests that governments may increasingly rely on data and real-time monitoring systems to track pollution and enforce regulations more effectively. He also points out that new technologies could lead to the creation of entirely new industries, which may require new regulations. In addition, he notes that lawmakers will need to respond to changes that are difficult to predict today. Overall, his answer highlights how advances in technology could shape both the development and enforcement of environmental laws. And that brings us to the end of today's lesson. We've gone through 8 questions related to environmental laws and public policy and broken down the main ideas behind each response. I hope you found the lesson helpful. If you'd like more practice, extra lessons, and exclusive content, consider becoming a member. Keep practicing, and I'll see you in the next one.